Hello and welcome again to Chapmanomics, to part 2 of our video looking at how we answer paper 3. In part 1 we looked at how we go through the paper, starting from the back and working our way forward, starting with our 25 markers, working our way through section B, then starting our 25 marker in section A and working our way through again to our 5 marker. This is part 2 of the video where we're going to look at how we actually write those essays. In the last part, we looked at the 7-part system that I put together to try to help you answer those questions. And now we're going to do a deep dive into the first part of that 7-part system. So without further ado, let's get over to the whiteboard and let's look at how the system works with a recap. And then we'll get into how it all works in practice. Here then is our 7-part Chapman system for writing essays. The first thing we do whenever we get a question is we read the question and we note down any and all economics topics that could relate to that question. We do that on our paper. Then we reread the question and just make sure that the topics we've noted down are the right ones for the question that we're being asked. If any of them aren't, we're going to cross those ones out. Thirdly, we're going to find the case study and we're going to read through the case study and we're going to cross out any of our points that don't match the case study. If they're not in there, get rid of them. They don't need to exist. After that, part 4, we're going to have a bunch of points left, hopefully, maybe just 2. And we're going to narrow down our points to having just the final 2 left, which are our 2 easiest points to talk about. We don't want to talk about the most complex ideas we can possibly think of. We want Occam's razor. We want the simplest of points that we can make. Once we have those points, it's time to model those points out. So we want to draw and explain 2 models that's going to show what is happening in our points and how things are changing as well in those points. Then looking at the models we've drawn and looking at the points we're going to make, we're going to find our evaluative points. So what in our theory, what in our point might mean that our theory isn't going to be quite right? What might actually mean that in practice, when this economic phenomenon happens, the theory doesn't quite capture everything that's going to happen. What is it about the real world that means maybe the opposite is going to happen to what we've actually just argued? And then finally, once we've got all those things noted down, we're then going to plan our essay using the Chapman structure that I'm going to teach you in a future video. So that's our structure, our 7-point plan. This lesson, we're going to focus on these first 4, finding our 2 points, how we go about doing that. And the best way I think to teach you guys is to look at an example. So here's a question from paper 3 in 2022. It is to evaluate the micro and macroeconomic effects of a depreciation in the pound. Refer to restaurants and other food delivery services in your answer. So the first step is read the question and come up with as many economics concepts as you possibly can. So I'm not going to worry about any of this stuff for now. I'm not going to read the case study. Instead, I'm going to try and think about what's the economics concept here and what are the topics that I can talk about. Let's have a look together. Evaluate the micro and macro effects. Okay, so I need to be thinking both micro and macro here. Of a depreciation of the pound. Well, there's our topic, is a depreciation of the pound. So let me think about all of the possible economic effects of a depreciation of the pound. So the pound goes down. That means the cost of imports, the price of imports increases. The pound goes down. That means that the price of exports decreases. Now also foreign currencies are worth more in the UK, so therefore that might lead to an increase, say, in tourism. That's another thing that I know that might happen as a result of this. I'm also going to talk about, well, the pound is now worth less abroad, then we might see a bit of cost push inflation happening. A little bit of cost push inflation happening as a result of all firms' costs going up if firms are importing things. We might also see a little increase in AD as a result of this X minus M component that we've been talking about in here. So we might see a little increase in AD. We might also see that perhaps firms are going to look to buy locally. So where previously, and this is in the long run, so we want to make sure that we talk about this being in the long run. Where previously firms might have imported, maybe in the long run they're going to actually look to homegrown firms because it's now simply too expensive to import. So here's a series of points then that we can talk about, these ones here. Series of points we talk about. You can have more than these. If you've thought of some other points, excellent, well done you. Your knowledge is fantastic. So now what we do is step 2. We are going to go back to our question and we're just going to make sure that every topic we've written about here is focusing on the question. So let's have a look. Evaluate the micro and macro effects of a depreciation in the pound. Let's have a look at what I've written. We've got an increase in the price of imports, a decrease in the price of exports, an increase in tourism, cost push inflation, increase in AD, and firms looking to buy locally. Now this point here, the last one, might have a little bit of a micro impact, but it's not huge. So therefore I must be missing a point. I need to add an extra point in, and that's going to be an increase in costs for firms. So here what I've already done is I've said, I've not actually fully answered the question. I would have just been talking about 2 macro points had I not done this. Now though, I've got this increase in cost for firms. I can talk about that in the cost and revenue model, for instance. So on to the next bit, the effects of a depreciation in the pound. Now, are all of these things effects of depreciations in the pound? Yes, they are. So I'm on the right lines. I'm then being asked to refer to restaurants or other food delivery services in my answer. Are any of these maybe not talking so much about food delivery services or restaurants? Well, price of imports increasing, that's probably pretty good. A decrease though in the price of exports. Now, are restaurants and food delivery services exporting? I somehow doubt it. So I can get rid of that idea of a decrease in price in exports. It's probably not going to be very relevant to this question. An increase in tourism though, well, restaurants tend to be in places where people want to go for dinner, and so perhaps there's going to be a few tourists kicking around, so we could talk about that. We'll see in a minute. Cost push inflation, that is probably going to be a macroeconomic point here. It might affect, a bit of cost push inflation might affect how often people go to restaurants, given that restaurants tend to be a luxury good, so maybe we'll leave that in for now. An increase in AD because of the X minus M component, I'm going to get rid of that, because I don't think that's going to be very relevant, because we've already taken out the point about decrease in the price of exports. Firms looking to buy locally, does that refer to restaurants and other food delivery services? Absolutely it does. If we were talking about perhaps a car manufacturer, for instance, maybe you just simply can't get the parts that you need in the UK. You maybe can't get the electric batteries you need, for instance, in the UK. Therefore, you couldn't look to buy locally. But in this case, we perhaps can. Increasing costs in firms, absolutely, again, it's all in there. Good. So we've gone through part 1 where we've written down as many economics points as we can. We've then narrowed them down based on the question that we're being asked. So it's now time to go over to our case study over here, see what we can find in our case study. So I'm going to give you a minute to have a read through this case study and see if you can find which of the points here are worth just wiping out and saying, no, we're not going to talk about those ones. Which ones are in the case study? After that minute is up, I'll then go through it together with you and do what I would suggest. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to read through that case study. Off you go. How did you get on? Hopefully you've been able to narrow my points down here to just 2 that are left. But if you haven't, don't worry, we're going to go through this together and I'm going to show you what I would do. For me, this case study all really rests on this last paragraph, and in particular, this last little bit here about restaurant profit margins being really small. And the effects of a 20% fall in the external value of the pound since 2016 on food costs are significant, given that over half of food and drink is sourced from outside the UK. This screams to me that this point about increasing costs for firms is going to be absolutely essential. It also suggests to me that perhaps what we're looking at is some cost push inflation, because if half of restaurants' food and drink is sourced outside the UK, it's probably likely to be the same for supermarkets and for others. And given that that's such a huge part of the basket of goods, it's probably also going to be the case. So actually, most of these points are in here. There's nothing really talking about tourism though, so I'm going to get rid of that. Firms looking to buy locally, we could talk about that. That's kind of in here, that if the price of these goods is going up, price of food and drink is going up, maybe they'll stop importing. Price of imports also there. Okay, so now we're left with these 4 points. So our fourth thing to do when we are answering a question is to now narrow down these 4 points to just the 2 easiest points to talk about. And they are going to be 2 points in our essays. So looking at this and looking at the question, I'm going to say that talking about firms buying locally is going to be a harder point to talk about than cost for firms. And that's because of this last line again, that half of food and drink is sourced outside the UK. And so therefore these firms are going to make a lot less money because they're probably going to have to still import. And we could actually use this point about buying locally a bit later on in our evaluation, but I'm going to get rid of that for now. I'm going to cross that one out and say no dice. Then looking at these last 3 points, I now need 1 macro point and 1 micro point. I need to remember that from the question. So therefore, this cost for firms has got to stay because that's going to be our micro point. And I've got the opportunity of increasing price of imports and cost push inflation. Well, cost push inflation to me sounds like a more likely outcome here. So I'm going to get rid of the price of imports. And now I'm left with simply 2 points here. One is about cost push inflation. That's going to be a macroeconomic effect of a depreciation in the pound. And one is about an increase in cost for firms. That's going to be my microeconomic point that I'm going to use. Now that went through things at a quite slow pace. In your actual exam, you need to go through it much, much quicker. So let's go through a second question together and let's have a look at going a bit quicker and how we would go about doing that. So first off, here's our question. Again, read the question first, come up with all your economics points. So evaluate the micro and macro effects of a significant increase in the minimum wage. Okay, so I'm going to do micro and macro minimum wage. The first thing I'm going to do is think about all those economics concepts I know about minimum wages. So I'm going to say inequality. One of the main reasons you put in place a minimum wage is to try and boost the pay of the lowest paid by taking some of the profit away from the highest paid. So inequality is definitely going to be our first point. Increase in costs for firms, right? Because this is an increase in the price of wages. So costs for firms, therefore, are going up. Maybe, again, some cost push. Inflation, if I could spell inflation correctly. Maybe some cost push inflation going on here. Maybe an increase in AD from an increase in consumption from those who are now on lower pay. Maybe they're going to be consuming a bit more. As a result, there might even be an increase in saving potentially from those people. We might see that happening. Let's have a think again on the micro side. So on the micro side, I might do a wage model. So wages are increasing. So macro effect is we're actually pushing up this minimum wage. So perhaps actually wage increase might equal a situation in which we've got excess supply of labour to the market. So I've now got a whole bunch of points and I'm thinking about this question the whole time, macro and micro, and significant increases in the minimum wage. Now I can go back to the question and have a quick look, evaluate macro and micro effects of significant increase in the minimum wage. Have I got macro? Have I got micro? So I've got micro here and I've got micro here. I've got macro here and I've got a bunch of macro stuff here. I'm good. Are these all to do with minimum wage? Yes, absolutely. So now it's over to the case study to see what we can find. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read the case study and see which of these points are in the case study and which you would talk about. 2 minutes. Off you go. how did you do? How did you get on? Hopefully you've read the case study and you're now able to narrow these down into just 2 points. So I'm going to look at this case study and I'm going to tell you what I would do. First thing I notice about this case study is that we're talking about an 8.7% increase. That is very significant. That's a huge amount of money. If you think about how many firms are hiring people on the minimum wage, that is a massive increase in those firms' costs. And if we think about the type of industries we're talking about here, we're talking about industries that maybe don't have huge profit margins. Now, in particular, they're giving you one, which is restaurants and food delivery services. I'm going to suggest that restaurants don't make a huge amount of money from every meal that they sell. Lots of them are about quantity. So the ones in particular that are hiring people on national minimum wage to deliver food and make drinks and things, those ones are probably not making a lot of money. Otherwise, they probably pay their employees a bit more. So therefore, as a result, I'm going to suggest that rising costs is going to be really, really vital here. Now, because of that, I can also have a look at this idea of excess supply, and I'm not really seeing that in here. So my micro point, I'm going to really focus on that increase in cost for firms, but I might add in here that therefore is going to decrease profit. And I'm going to then think about later on what the kind of market is for that. Secondly, I'm then going to look at what else is in this particular case study. Well, do we see an increase in AD and an increase in consumption? No, that's not in there. Do we see anything to do with cost push inflation? Not really. Do we see anything to do with an increase in saving? Not really. But what we do see, however, is that those that are eligible for the national living wage, reducing that age to 23 and increasing it by 8.7%, and our delivery drivers getting around £1 an hour for firms that we know are very, very large firms here. I'm going to suggest that this is all going to lead to a bit of a decrease in inequality. We're going to see equality in the UK get better. That Gini coefficient is going to get closer to 0. So as a result, I've now narrowed it down to just my 2 points. Now, these are not necessarily the right points. These are just the 2 that I would talk about. If you figure that there's more of something in a case study, if you figure that these are not the 2 points you would have chosen, that is absolutely fine. This is just my way of doing it. And this is just the 2 points I would choose. Hopefully that's nice and clear. Now you've got a good idea of how this system works, I'm going to put it over to you guys to come up with 2 points. So here is another question for you. It is with reference to extract C, discuss the likely effects of increasing integration within the food delivery market. So it's up to you now to come up with your points of what you would talk about by using that 4-step process. Start by reading the question and noting down all the economics topics you possibly can. Then narrow them down based on the question. After that, read the case study, narrow down your points even further based on what the case study says, and then finally narrow it down to just the 2 easiest points for you to talk about. There's your question. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do this. If you are new to this, maybe pause the video, take a little bit longer than the 3 minutes. But if you're well practiced at this and well rehearsed, go for it and try and do it in a minute or less. Okay, 3 minutes, off you go. Okay, how did you do? Hopefully you are sat there with 2 points in front of you that you could write about in an exam, and you managed to do it within the time frame that I gave you. This system is so important for making sure that you're coming up with the right points in the right context. Just to show you what I would do for this example is I would look at this question, and I'm going to look at increasing integration, and I'm going to say, right, what do I know about increasing integration? Well, I know it's monopoly power for the firm. I know that maybe there's some consumer abuse possible. I know that also this could lead to economies of scale. And finally, I know that increasing integration can actually lead to the minimum efficient scale being achieved. So we could actually achieve some dynamic efficiency over the long run, but also some inefficiency in terms of markets and how they actually come to supply and demand, and whether or not we are allocatively efficient. So they're my points that I'm going to make. It's monopoly power, consumer abuse, economies of scale, dynamic efficiency, and then other forms of efficiency. And if I look at this question again, we're talking about increasing integration and the effects of them. Well, these are all the effects potentially of increasing integration. Then I'm going to go back and look at extract C, because that's what I'm being asked to look at. So those of you who've looked at figure 1 here, this was a bit of a red herring. You're being asked about extract C, so I need to go back and make sure I've got some points from extract C. So let's see what we can scrub out and what we can get rid of from this. Well, Competition and Markets Authority is carefully watching to make sure that no one firm has complete control over the food industry. So that means we are talking about things like monopoly power. We then have down here that there's a 30% commission. That to me sounds like consumer abuse. To be honest, that sounds like prices are being pushed up much higher than is economically efficient. But that we've got Amazon restaurants that bought 16% of Deliveroo. Well, if I know anything about Amazon and if I know anything about Deliveroo is delivering food. Amazon is very, very good at the tech stuff. So therefore, economies of scale and dynamic efficiency might be achieved here. But also then, I'm looking at this and I'm suggesting that the sheer volume of these customers makes it a very difficult deal to turn down. And so maybe as a result, what we're potentially going to see is some levels of inefficiency as a result, because there's some resentment from small business owners who are angry at being wholly dependent on these tech companies. So therefore, we're probably not going to be allocatively efficient, I would imagine. So actually, all my points here are possible points to make. So now I need to narrow them down to just the 2 that I would make in this case. Now, what are the 2 for me that are the easiest to talk about? Well, for me, I'm going to say monopoly power is a little bit woolly. It's a bit hard for me to make decent points about, particularly when I'm being asked about the food delivery market. So I'm not going to talk about monopoly power. Dynamic efficiency, I don't know, maybe we'll get there in the long run, but I think economies of scale are probably easier for me to talk about when it comes to this particular case. If Amazon and Deliveroo are kind of merging together, or if it was takeaway.com merging with Just Eat, if those guys are merging together, I think we can talk about managerial economies of scale and certainly technical economies of scale, that the expertise from the 2 companies can be merged together. So economies of scale seems good here. The inefficiency point, it's there, but it's maybe a little bit tough to talk about. So now I'm left with consumer abuse, and I think that's a really easy point to talk about because I can simply show a model that doesn't have allocative efficiency in the market, and I can kind of talk about inefficiency there as well. So now I'm left with my 2 points, consumer abuse and economies of scale. They'd be the 2 that I would use. Okay, I'm going to give you one final question, but I'm not going to go through this question with you. Instead, I'm just going to put this one up on the board. So there's your question there. Just going to put it up on the board, leave it up for a second. If you'd like to pause the video and give this one a try, I'd highly recommend it. If you need help, give me a comment down below and I can let you know maybe what I would do or what I think of your particular points. So pause the video now if you want to give this one a go. The rest of you, or those of you who have just finished that question, thank you for looking through this video and thank you for sticking with me until the end. I know these things are hard and I know these things are hard work, but it's well worth doing it. And that's how we find our 2 points that allow us access now to gaining the top level of marks, because we're showing great knowledge and we're showing great application already before we've even written a word of our essay. The next step is to go through and find what models we can now draw from those points that we have just made. And that's going to be the topic of the next video. If you do have any questions or any comments, anything you'd like me to do differently even, please drop them down below and I'll do my very, very best to get back to you. But for now, until the next video, goodbye.